walls wide enough for a chariot to turn around on top of them. A moat filled by a river. 100 bronze gates, if the ancient writers are to be believed. Storehouses stocked deep enough to outlast a siege of years. That was Babylon in 539 BCE. On paper, the hardest capital in the world to take. And it fell in a single night, without its walls ever being breached. 4 questions are going to drive this story, and I'm going to answer all 4 before the end. Why did the empire's own army lose the war weeks before anyone reached the capital? What actually happened at the gates that night? Was a king really reading his fortune off a wall while it happened? And how much of what we think we know is history, and how much is the winning side's propaganda? Keep one image in your head while we go. A brick, still wet, with a king's name pressed into it. We're going to end there. Imagine, for a moment, a scribe working in the temple archive at Esagila. His job, most days, is unglamorous, copying administrative tablets, dating them, filing them. We don't know his name, and we don't know that a single individual like him ever stood exactly where this story places him. But scribes like him are how a document called the Babylonian Chronicle came to exist. The terse, dateline-stamped record that survives from this period. Using an imagined figure like this is a way of standing inside the year 539 BCE. Instead of only looking down at it from a distance. Where this script gives him sensations or reactions, that's a narrative device, not a claim about a documented person. His hands, in this imagining, smell like wet clay and bitumen. Mesopotamia has almost no usable stone. It's a river delta, built from silt, so most of what rises around him is baked earth and asphalt. Mud brick where cost matters. Fired brick sealed with bitumen where it has to last. That smell, bitumen on warm brick, is the smell of Babylon holding itself together. The walls in this story are real, even if not every ancient number survived scrutiny. An inner ring and an outer ring, with a moat drawn from the Euphrates. Canals do double duty as both irrigation and defense. Multiple gates, each one a choke point. And one gate will outlast every other part of the city in memory. Glazed blue brick. Lions, bulls, and the horned, scaled Mushushu, the dragon of Marduk, march toward the processional way, the Ishtar Gate. None of this worked alone. The Euphrates ran straight through the city rather than around it. So any approach from north or south had to cross defended water first. The moat, the double wall, the canal network, and the gates weren't separate features. They were layers, each one meant to slow an attacker just long enough for the next layer to matter. This wasn't a wall. It was a system. Every detail, the glaze, the animal reliefs, the scale of the brickwork, comes from the ground itself.
These details come not just from ancient writers, but from what excavators actually found.
We'll come back to where and how it was dug up. For now, just hold the image. This isn't a reconstruction from text alone. Excavators have stood inside these gates. This isn't just a fortress. It's a functioning megacity, split by a river. Palace and temple precinct on one side, markets and workshops on the other, connected by a bridge. The same canal system that could drown an invading army also fed the fields that fed the city. Babylon's defense and Babylon's economy were, in large part, the same machine.
And a fortress like this wasn't built to survive one bad afternoon.
Behind the walls sat granaries stocked from Babylonia's farmland, fed by the same canals that watered the fields. It was a city built to outlast a siege, measured in years, not days. Which is what makes the real question so sharp. If Babylon had the walls, the water, and the food to hold out indefinitely, the mystery isn't how anyone got through the defenses. It's why the system behind those defenses stopped functioning as one. The city wasn't always this. It was built by one king in particular, Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 BCE and rebuilt Babylon into the monument later writers would remember. New walls, new temples, the processional way, the Ishtar Gate, the towering Ziggurat Etemenanki. He pressed his own name into thousands of bricks across the city, over and over. The king writing himself into the walls he raised. Those inscribed bricks aren't a literary flourish either. They've been pulled out of the ground by the thousands, stamped in cuneiform. And they're part of the same physical record we'll return to later. In 586 BCE, his armies destroyed Jerusalem and carried its people into exile. For them, and for the generations after them, Babylon stopped being just a city. It became a symbol of empire, of arrogance, of everything a conquered people. But an empire runs on more than an army. It runs on its god. Babylon's patron was Marduk, worshipped at Esagila, beside Etemenanki. Some later traditions connect towers like Etemenanki to the biblical Tower of Babel. That's a later interpretive link, not something the Babylonian sources themselves claim. And it's worth being honest about that distinction here, rather than papering over it. What the sources do show clearly, a king needed Marduk's favor, or the appearance of it, to rule Babylon legitimately. Remember that. It becomes the whole second half of this story. The trouble starts when Nabonidus becomes king in 556 BCE and almost immediately breaks the pattern, elevating Sin, the moon god, over Marduk, in ways that unsettle Babylon's priesthood. Then Nabonidus does something no Neo-Babylonian king had done. He leaves. For roughly a decade, the sources place him not in Babylon but far southwest, at the oasis of Timur in the Arabian desert. Why he stayed that long is genuinely unresolved. Trade, religious motive, and control of desert routes have all been proposed, but no explanation has settled the debate. What's certain is the effect inside the walls. Someone has to actually run the capital in his place. That someone is Belshazzar, Nabonidus' son. For a long time, the fullest ancient king lists for this period named only Nabonidus. And readers of the Book of Daniel, which centers Belshazzar as king, were left wondering whether Daniel had simply gotten it wrong. Then, cuneiform documents surfaced naming Belshazzar directly, confirming a real historical figure who had been known, until then, mostly from a biblical text skeptics assumed was fiction. With his father gone from the city for years at a stretch, Belshazzar appears to hold real day-to-day authority in Babylon. There's a strange detail in Daniel worth sitting with. The reward on offer that final night is to be made third ruler in the kingdom. Not second, not first. One reading is that with Nabonidus as first and Belshazzar effectively second. Third was the highest rank Belshazzar actually had the power to hand out. That's an interpretation, not a settled fact, but it's an oddly specific detail for a text to invent by accident. What matters here isn't simply that a king was away. Babylon entered the war with an unusual and untested arrangement at the top. A king who held the title, but not the presence. And a son who held the presence, but not the full title. That's not a structure built for a crisis. It's a structure that happened to still be standing when one arrived. An absent king. A son standing in for him. A priesthood already uneasy. This is the situation Babylon is in when the war begins. By 539 BCE, Cyrus II isn't a rising warlord. He's already the ruler of most of the map. He had absorbed Media roughly a decade earlier, in 550 BCE, and crushed the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia in 546 BCE. What faces Babylon that year isn't an army testing its luck. It's the largest power in the region, arriving with everything else already secured behind it. The evidence doesn't support a picture of Cyrus battering the capital and being thrown back. The war is decided before he ever reaches Babylon's walls. At Opis, on the Tigris. Roughly 50 miles northeast of Babylon. In the Babylonian month of Tashritu, corresponding to September or October 539 BCE, the Babylonian army meets Cyrus's forces in the field and loses. The Babylonian Chronicle records the battle briefly, without casualty figures or dramatic detail. That terse notice is typical of a source that records what mattered without dramatizing it. But Opis matters for another reason. North of Babylon stood a major defensive barrier, later known as the Median Wall, associated with the northern approaches to the capital and with defensive works constructed under Nebuchadnezzar II. Opis lay within this wider defensive zone. Once Babylonian resistance collapsed there, the northern defensive system was no longer protecting the road toward the capital. The significance isn't that Opis was some single magic gate into Babylon. It's that the northern defensive system had failed before Cyrus ever reached the capital. That's question one, answered. Babylon wasn't defeated at its walls. Its field army had already lost the war outside them. In Sippar, one of Babylonia's major cities, roughly 30 miles north of the capital, on the Euphrates. The chronicle dates its fall to the 14th of Tashritu, a matter of days after Opis, not weeks. According to the chronicle, it falls without a battle. Its people are said to offer no resistance at all. Two cities, one beaten in the field, one that simply opens. Neither of them Babylon. And with Sippar gone, the capital's entire northern approach stands open. Babylon itself is now only a short march away from a force it has already failed to stop twice. The chronicle records that Nabonidus fled at this point. He doesn't appear to make a final stand at the capital he's supposed to be defending. Lay the sequence out plainly. Because the speed is the point. Opis falls. Within days, Sippar falls. Nabonidus retreats rather than making a stand. Babylon's northern approach now stands completely open. And within roughly 2 weeks of that first defeat at Opis, troops are inside the capital itself. This isn't a siege stretched over months. It's a collapse measured in days. Here's the moment worth sitting with, and it's the center of the whole story. There is no clear evidence that Babylon's walls were ever breached by a major assault. The walls excavators later uncovered, the ones thick enough to carry a road along their top, show no burn layer, no breach, no siege damage, consistent with a fight for the fortifications themselves. And the empire behind those walls is already finished. The siege everyone half expects, the kind remembered like Troy, never has to happen, because there's almost nothing left to besiege. An empire is falling, and the capital city itself hasn't lost a single fight within its own walls. Long before any of this, other texts had already pictured this ending. The book of Isaiah names Babylon's downfall directly, and in chapters 44 and 45, names Cyrus by name as the one who brings it. Many historical critical scholars date these particular chapters much closer to the exile itself, rather than generations earlier. A real, live, scholarly debate about authorship and dating, not a settled fact either way. Jeremiah, in chapters 50 and 51, invokes Babylon's waters and its walls in similar terms. Hold on to 2 images from these texts, gates and rivers. They become relevant again very soon. Night falls. A festival is underway in the palace. According to the book of Daniel, Belshazzar holds a great feast that night and drinks from vessels taken years earlier from Jerusalem's temple. And 4 words appear on the wall: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Here's the part worth slowing down for, because it's a wordplay most retellings skip past. Parsin is the plural of Peres, and Peres, in the text's own reading, splits into 2 meanings at once. It means divided, and it sounds like Paras, Persia. The writing on the wall isn't just a warning. Read one way, it's the invader's name folded into the sentence describing the kingdom's fracture. It's a bilingual pun, sitting in plain sight in the text. Whether you read that as prophecy, literary artistry after the fact, or a story shaped around an outcome already known, the wordplay itself is real, and it's one of the most striking pieces of ancient wordcraft attached to this event. Beyond the walls, the non-biblical record gives us something specific and easy to miss. And it complicates the image most people carry away from this story. Cyrus conquered Babylon, but Cyrus wasn't the man who first walked through its gates. The chronicle records that on the 16th of Tashritu, troops under a commander named Ugbaru, governor of Gutium, fighting for Cyrus, entered Babylon. Cyrus himself did not. His own entry into the city comes roughly 2 weeks later, on the 3rd of Arachsamnu. Whatever happened at the gates that night, and however Belshazzar's feast really ended, Ugbaru's soldiers stood in the doorway. Not the king and the whole conquest gets remembered by. Put plainly, Babylon falls before Cyrus himself ever enters it. The man history credits with taking the city arrived to one that had already changed hands. From here, the sources become more complicated, because they are not 3 perfectly independent witnesses telling the same story. The Babylonian Chronicle is extremely valuable because it was produced close to the events and preserves a detailed chronological framework. But it is not a neutral battlefield report. Its presentation of Nabonidus and Cyrus reflects the political and religious climate surrounding the fall of the dynasty. The Cyrus Cylinder tells a similar ideological story from Cyrus's side.
It presents Nabonidus as a ruler who failed Babylon, and Cyrus as the king chosen by Marduk to restore order.
And another text makes that political case even more aggressively, the verse account of Nabonidus. This poetic composition portrays Nabonidus as religiously misguided, politically incompetent, and alienated from Babylon's own institutions. These texts shouldn't simply be stacked together as three independent confirmations of the same story. They participate in a broader Babylonian political narrative that took shape around the transfer of power. Nabonidus failed the city, Marduk rejected him, and Cyrus arrived as the legitimate restorer.
That doesn't make the chronicle useless.
It means separating two different questions. How reliable is it for what happened and when? Versus how reliable is it as an explanation of why it happened? Herodotus and Xenophon, writing in Greek generations later, sit outside that Babylonian political bloc, but they bring their own distance from the events and their own storytelling instincts.
None of these sources alone gives us the whole room. Herodotus's diverted river is vivid and specific.
It would neatly explain how an army crossed a defended waterway without a naval fight.
It's also not something archaeology can confirm in full.
Some of it is plausible, given what's known of the canal system. Some of it is simply unverifiable from where we stand now. That's worth saying plainly, rather than smoothing it into certainty. The other recurring image, across Greek and biblical traditions alike, is a city that let its conqueror walk in, rather than met him at the threshold. Whether that's a literal detail or a shared piece of imagery, it shows up again and again. Had Babylon actually stopped resisting that night? Or had it already stopped resisting days earlier? At Opis and at Sippar, and the gate was just the last formality?
The river explains a possible route in. The gates explain a possible way through.
Neither one explains why a fortress this formidable was vulnerable enough to fall this easily in the first place. The real failure happened before the walls. Line the pieces up. Babylon's fortifications show no clear evidence of having been breached by a major assault.
They didn't need to be broken if they could simply be bypassed.
Internal instability and Nabonidus's long absence had already strayed the capital's capacity to resist. Cyrus's advance through the north, Opis then Sippar, had already isolated Babylon before any confrontation reached its walls. Each fell just days apart, with almost no fight. The greatest fortress in the ancient world becomes irrelevant the moment an attacker stops trying to break it, and finds a way around it instead. Here's the part that complicates the victory. Cyrus doesn't raze the city. He doesn't burn its temples or gut its institutions overnight. The administration largely keeps functioning. The temples keep operating. Babylon stays one of the great cities of the empire that now owns it.
Not a smoking ruin, but a functioning capital under new management.
He didn't need to destroy Babylon, he needed to hold it. Those are different jobs. That political message survives most clearly in Cyrus's own Babylonian proclamation, the Cyrus Cylinder.
The object is extraordinary, but it's important to understand what it actually is. It is not a battlefield report. It is not neutral history. It is a royal ideological text, written in Babylonian religious and political language to present Cyrus's conquest as restoration rather than domination. Cyrus is presented as chosen by Marduk. Nabonidus is portrayed as a ruler who failed Babylon's religious and political order. Cyrus, by contrast, enters the city as the king who restores temples, rituals, and proper worship. Modern scholars, Amélie Courte among them, have emphasized this legitimizing function. The cylinder belongs to a long Mesopotamian tradition. In that tradition, a new ruler establishes legitimacy by portraying the previous ruler as having violated the proper order. The cylinder is studied today largely through the collection and scholarship associated with the British Museum, where it's held. That is why the cylinder matters so much. It doesn't simply tell us what Cyrus did. It tells us how Cyrus wanted his conquest understood. The same broader political environment also produced hostile accounts of Nabonidus. One of these hostile sources is the verse account of Nabonidus. These texts build a powerful narrative. Nabonidus had lost the favor of Marduk. Babylon had suffered under him, and Cyrus arrived as the legitimate alternative. Was Cyrus genuinely welcomed by Babylon's religious establishment? Possibly. Did he also have every reason to present his conquest as liberation rather than conquest? Absolutely. The sources cannot fully separate those two things, and what's certain is that Cyrus needed Babylon's priesthood, the guardians of Esagila and Etemenanki, to accept him. That's a power he had every reason not to alienate. The night didn't end the same way for Babylon's two most important figures. According to the Book of Daniel, Belshazzar dies that very night, right after the writing appears on the wall. Nabonidus has a different fate. The Babylonian Chronicle records that after Sippar fell, Nabonidus fled. Cyrus's forces then entered Babylon. And the city was taken without the kind of battle its enormous walls might have suggested. Nabonidus was later captured after returning to the capital. He was not executed. That much the record supports clearly. What happened next is less certain. Later traditions place him in exile, possibly in the region of Carmania. But the details of his later life remain genuinely uncertain. That contrast matters. Belshazzar becomes, in the biblical account, the king who dies at the moment of Babylon's fall. Nabonidus survives the conquest. The man who had ruled the empire disappears from political history, while Cyrus takes his place. The dynasty is finished. Babylon itself is not. Everything so far survived first as written memory: chronicles, royal inscriptions, biblical texts, and later Greek histories. Then archaeology put the city back under our feet. Robert Coldwey began excavating Babylon in 1899. His work exposed fortification remains, streets, temple precincts, and the monumental processional way. It also uncovered bricks bearing Nebuchadnezzar's name and fallen glazed brick fragments from the Ishtar Gate. Lions, bulls, and mushhushu appeared among the fragments, intact enough to reassemble. Many were later reconstructed into the Ishtar Gate, now displayed in Berlin's Pergamon Museum. The material is genuine, but the museum gate is a modern assembly of ancient pieces. It is not the original structure lifted intact out of Iraq. But archaeology didn't simply confirm every ancient description. In some respects, it made the contradictions harder to ignore.
Herodotus describes Babylon in enormous terms, and famously claims it had 100 bronze gates.
The excavated city doesn't neatly match that. Babylon is generally associated with far fewer principal gates. And the 100 gates figure is widely treated with skepticism by historians. Herodotus was also writing generations after Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, and was not a first-hand observer of the city at its height. Some of what he records may reflect traditions circulating about Babylon rather than direct measurement. So what happens when Herodotus and the archaeological record disagree? The honest move isn't to invent a tidy explanation that makes them fit together. Sometimes the evidence simply conflicts, and that conflict is itself informative. Ancient Babylon survives through unequal layers of evidence. Royal propaganda, chronicles, biblical literature, Greek tradition, and excavated brick. None of them should be allowed to quietly speak for all the others. And beneath all of them, in the brick itself, the same name keeps appearing: Nebuchadnezzar. Before any conclusion, it's worth sorting the evidence by how solid it actually is. Strong evidence. Babylon existed and was extensively monumentalized under Nebuchadnezzar II. Cyrus conquered it in 539 BCE, ending the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nabonidus and Belshazzar were both real historical figures, confirmed by cuneiform sources independent of the Bible. Babylon continued as an inhabited, functioning city under Persian and later Hellenistic rule. Strong but interpretive, Belshazzar's exact role as his father's stand-in. The extent to which Nabonidus's religious policies and long absence weakened Babylon's political cohesion. The precise relationship between the Babylonian Chronicle, the Cyrus Cylinder, and the hostile accounts of Nab are genuinely uncertain. The exact mechanism Cyrus's forces used to enter the city, diverted river, opened gates, or some combination described differently by later traditions. The precise sequence of that single night, how literally to read the imagery in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel against the chronicled and physical record. One more distinction is worth keeping. We have relatively strong evidence that the conquest happened. We have much weaker evidence for the dramatic mechanics of how it happened on the ground that night. The Chronicle tells us Babylon fell. Herodotus gives us a river. Daniel gives us a feast and a writing on the wall. Cyrus gives us a story of restoration. Archaeology gives us the walls, the gates, the temples, and the bricks. The challenge isn't picking one of these and discarding the rest. It's knowing exactly what each source is actually capable of telling us. Was Babylon really unbreakable? No, but not because the engineering failed. The walls did exactly what they were built to do. A city, though, is never only its walls. It's also its political system, its army, its leadership, its supply lines, its intelligence, its morale. Any one of those can fail while the walls stand perfectly intact. The empire disappeared. The dynasty disappeared. Belshazzar disappeared in a single night. Nabonidus disappeared from the center of power. Cyrus remained.
And Babylon itself survived for centuries after the man who conquered it had become another name in history.
Then even the city faded. The palaces collapsed. The temples fell.
The streets disappeared beneath the soil.
But the bricks remained, some still in Iraq, some carried into museums.
Some still carry the name a king pressed into wet clay more than 25 centuries ago. He believed it would outlast him. It did. Babylon's walls did not fail because they were weak. They failed because the world around them had already changed. That night, the walls were still standing.
But what happens to a fortress when the power behind it has already fallen?